Hello everyone, Vincent here from HDTV Test here. I'm a TV reviewer and professional calibrator. In this video, I'm going to show you how to watch Blue Planet 2 in HLG HDR on a television that's compatible and also from a Sky Q box. And I'm going to do a comparison between the HDR version and the SDR version. To watch Blue Planet 2 in UHD HLG HDR on the internal iPlayer app on this LG 2017 OLED television, go into the BBC iPlayer app. The first time you actually fire it up, it will actually ask you whether you want to watch the UHD version, but you've actually watched it and got past the page. You can find the UHD version of Blue Planet 2 right at the bottom of the home page. So click on any of them and you can see that at the top right corner a HLG HDR notification has come up, and this is playing in HLG HDR. To watch Blue Planet 2 in UHD resolution on the Sky Q box, first go into your home screen and then scroll down to Catch Up TV. Click on it, click on BBC iPlayer, and then go down to Ultra HD, where you will find all 7 episodes of Blue Planet 2 in UHD resolution. Now, if you click on any of them, you should be able to start downloading and watching it. I've already watched a bit of the first episode, but I'm going to click on here to resume download and start from scratch. So I'm going to pause it here, remove the player bar, and then what I'm going to do is to talk you through the output from the Sky Q box. Now the Sky Q box is not HLG enabled yet, so the Blue Planet 2 output is going to be in a higher resolution of UHD, but not in HDR or high dynamic range. If we click on the information bar here on this television, you can see that it has a resolution of 2160p, but it is not in HDR, nor is it in Rec 2020 color gamut, so it is quite likely that Sky Q is still outputting Rec 709 for this BBC episode of Blue Planet 2. But this does allow us to compare the HDR version versus the SDR version, even though they are likely to be mastered differently. I don't know whether the version on the Sky Q box is how should I put it, is a HLG downgraded to a SDR version, but at least I can use it to compare with the HLG HDR version that is rendered by the internal BBC iPlayer app on this LG B7 OLED television, and hopefully I can show you the benefits that HDR bring to your viewing experience. Let's do some comparisons. This is a frame quite early on in the first episode of Blue Planet 2, where Sir David Attenborough is standing on an ocean liner. Now, if you think that the shadow detail on the ship is a bit dark, that is because the camera that I'm using has a limited dynamic range, but this image is being played through the BBC iPlayer app on this LG B7 OLED, which is encoded in HLG HDR. So it has an extremely high dynamic range, which is not fully captured by my camera. And I wanted to properly expose the specular highlight detail, which is why I had to lower the exposure, and therefore causing the shadow details on the ship to look darker than what it actually looks like in real life. But I'm going to talk you through what I'm actually seeing on the scene here. So high dynamic range is meant to provide a greater dynamic range for filmmakers to portray their images, and certainly on this HDR scene here, what I can see is that there's more depth to the entire image, because the sunlight that is reflecting off the ocean waves are more accurately rendered, and you can see more of these individual waves. And because you can see so far into the horizon, the sense of depth is actually increased quite substantially. But if we switch to the SDR version that is being output by the Sky Q box. Okay. Now what I can say is that the whole image just looks extremely washed out compared with the HLG HDR version, because you see around this area here where the sunlight is actually hitting the waves, the reflections, because it is so bright, it is actually blowing out the individual waves, so you can't actually see the ocean waves being portrayed in an accurate and in a discrete manner. So you get this really, how should I put it, all the waves blend together into a piece of white, which actually distorts our perception of depth to the entire image. So we think that, the distance between this point here where this magic cursor is not as far versus this distance here, whereas on the HLG HDR version that is played through the BBC iPlayer app, because you can still make out all the individual waves with the correct amount of light and reflections bouncing off these waves, you get a much more realistic sense of depth and dimensionality to the entire image. The next frame I'm going to use for this comparison is this shot of Sir David Attenborough. And what I can say about this image, which is rendered in HLG HDR by the BBC iPlayer app on this LG 2017 OLED, is that there's just an insane amount of depth that is actually popping through the screen here. And part of the reason is because of the correct rendition of the bright highlight detail. If you look at his linen shirt, it is still retaining the wrinkles and the linen qualities that is portrayed so accurately by this HDR format and also by this display. And if you pay attention to the left of his head, where his white hair is almost blowing out, you can still see strands, albeit very, very subtly. You can still see strands of white hair individually against each other, which gives us that sense of depth, that perception of detail that may be lacking in non-HDR content. And we shall switch to the Sky Q version, which is outputting it in SDR to compare. So I may not have paused at the exact same frame, but hopefully you get the idea. So again, the SDR version just looks bleached and washed out. If you pay attention to his linen shirt here, the texture and also the wrinkles that characterize linen fabric is just not as apparent as what is actually rendered on the HDR version. You can see it blowing out here with the texture of the linen and also the wrinkles disappearing. And also if you pay attention to his white hair here, it is blown out to a much greater degree than the HDR version. And therefore it robs the image of this sense of depth, this sense of realism that is provided by HDR. Also, one thing that you may notice is that his skin tones here look more bleached and paler compared with the HDR version, which retains the transition of light from brighter to the darker parts of his face in a much more realistic and accurate manner, whereas this one looks as if there's a really strong light here shining on his face. Also, his skin tones just look a bit off here, even though I've calibrated this preset to the standard that is used within the film and broadcast industry, D65 white point, 2.4 gamma, Rec 709 colors. But when the source is not HDR, and I don't know how it's mastered, whether it's actually downgraded from HLG or it is just mastered as SDR per se, but overall the image just lacks depth, just lacks the punch that the HDR presentation delivers. Okay, this frame is an easy one for me to talk about. Look at the clouds in the horizon just at the top left of the screen. you can see how the cloud retain most of the detail, which is really quite realistic, and how it actually reflects off the ocean in the horizon, yet the ocean still retains the individual waves, giving us a really profound sense of depth from the front to the back of the picture. It gives us this telescopic view that gives us this really immersive viewing experience when watched in HDR. Now, if we switch to the SDR version on Sky Q, and if I press this, and you can see that the detail in the cloud is less obvious than what was presented on the HDR version. The whole horizon actually looks bleached, looks washed out, with the reflections of the cloud on the ocean waves being, how shall I put it, diluted by this blown out SDR contrast, because there's just not enough dynamic range to accurately capture all these nuances that are present in the HDR version. And so the whole picture has this really hazy look, like there's a film in front of the screen. If you switch to the HDR version, it's as if you're actually peeling away this film, giving you much better depth and clarity. Oh, one thing that I need to point out is that on LG's 2017 WebOS 3.5 system, if we try and switch directly back to the BBC iPlayer, for some reason it is still playing it in HLG HDR, but is zoomed in by quite a lot. I'm not sure whether this is because the WebOS interface is inherently 1080p, and therefore it is rendering this video app as 1080p once you swap it back. But to get back to a UHD version, I have had to play another movie and then get out from there and then go down to Blue Planet 2 again, and I have to play it from scratch. You can see a HLG HDR notification pops out on the top right corner. The underwater scenes usually present a great challenge to 4K televisions in terms of gradation, but on the HLG HDR presentation by this LG 2017 OLED, I can quite happily say that the posterization, even though it's there if you actually look for it, especially around the top left corner where the brighter light source is gradually transitioning into darker parts of the ocean, it is there, but it is fairly subtle. It is not as obvious as, let's say, an 8-bit content. Now let's switch to the SDR version and see what's happening there. So let's go into HDMI 1. So I can see very distinct striping around this area here, from the brighter light source to the darker part of the ocean. You can see these stripes here that are actually quite inaccurately colored, especially around this area, and also around this area there's sort of a different color tint to it, whereas the HLG HDR version is much more uniform with a much cleaner transition. This is a frame featuring lots of corals with various colors, and what I can say about this HLG HDR presentation is that it looks more vibrant and less desaturated than the SDR version, which I'll go to in a second. But I'm not entirely sure whether the reason is because of a more accurate EOTF, or electro-optical transfer function, which will also impact on the colors, or it's just by virtue of a REC 2020 color mastering. But let's go to the SDR version on Sky Q and see what it looks like. Right off the bat, what I can say is that the colors look more washed out and the detail is more indistinct, especially around this region here, where on the HDR version you can still see the individual stems or tentacles quite discreetly, but here it's all meshed up, and also the blue of the ocean and just various colors, they are all being diluted by a lower dynamic range. And so the entire SDR image doesn't look as engaging, doesn't really look as impactful as the HDR version. As you can hopefully see from the frames that I've selected for comparison, the HDR presentation in HLG format, that's hybrid log gamma format, is superior to the SDR rendition because of how the increased dynamic range can allow the light to be distributed in a more accurate and precise manner. So reflections of surfaces look more realistic and enhance the perception of depth that we can actually glean from the picture. And a couple of things that I need to actually touch on in terms of the HLG format, which has actually been developed by the BBC and also the NHK. Now, this is not the first time that BBC has actually delivered this HDR format for broadcast purposes. They did a trial of the Planet Earth 2 also through their iPlayer. And one thing to note is that the Blue Planet 2, it is the entire series, all 7 episodes, all available in HLG HDR. And what I can say is that it looks absolutely gorgeous, and the sumptuous presentation in terms of the gradation, in terms of the high dynamic range, in terms of the color vibrance is just one notch above the SDR presentation. And what is really impressive is also that the app, when it actually starts rendering each episode, the buffering is kept to a minimal level. If you have experienced other streaming services, let's say from the likes of Netflix and Amazon, sometimes it can take a bit of time before the content actually kicks into the highest resolution. Let's say from SD to 1080p to 4K resolution, especially with Amazon, there's a bit of buffering going on. Even if you have the fastest broadband in the world, it can take some time to kick into different layers before reaching the peak resolution. But the impressive thing about the BBC iPlayer app, especially on this LG 2017 OLED television, is that there seems to be very little buffering at all. It just kicks into the highest resolution quite quickly. Obviously, I have quite a fast broadband, but I believe that this is the quickest and the most seamless user experience I've seen from a streaming service. Another point that I need to touch on with regards to HLG. HLG is designed as a backwards compatible HDR format. What it means is that there will be a single stream that is being delivered, and then if your TV is not HLG compatible, it will just degrade to it will just be downgraded. I don't like to use the word degrade, but it will just be downgraded to the SDR presentation for your TV to be displayed. But I like the term graceful degradation, and this is a term that I learned from the web side of things. But graceful degradation is what makes HLG unique. But in terms of the HLG visual storytelling, it is certainly very, very impressive from the likes of the BBC and also being displayed on this LG OLED. So I would like to congratulate the BBC R&D department for bringing all 7 episodes. There are a lot of murky underwater scenes which would present a great challenge on many displays, but certainly the HLG presentation and HLG delivery of the BBC iPlayer seems to overcome this challenge quite easily in terms of maintaining a very smooth transition gradation while minimizing the macro blocking artifacts in these scenes. And I would also like to say well done to LG for being so on the ball, because their 2017 and 2016 LG OLEDs, they are capable of playing HLG HDR content through this BBC iPlayer app from the get-go, whereas some other companies are still struggling to update their BBC iPlayer application to be able to display this Blue Planet 2 in HDR HLG format. And one last thing that I want to touch on about HLG is that even with the Planet Earth 2 trial and also with this Blue Planet 2 presentation, I can see that BBC is using the iPlayer as the main mechanism for delivery. And I think this is quite important because it shows us that even in this day and age, I don't think there is enough bandwidth to support broadcast HDR entirely over the air, and some part of it needs to be delivered through IP or the internet. And so broadband speed and internet connection may play an important part as to how effective the delivery of HDR content from the broadcast point of view is. But I'm extremely excited by the Blue Planet 2 presentation in HLG HDR on the 2017 LG OLED, and I hope that many other brands will be updating their TVs and their BBC iPlayer application fast enough before the expiry date. I think probably in the middle of January, when all 7 episodes will be taken off BBC iPlayer, so that owners can start enjoying these 7 episodes in really quite fantastic HDR. If you found this video useful, please click the like button and subscribe to the HDTV Test YouTube channel for more videos like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where sometime in the near future I'll need to talk about HDMI 2.1 and its implications.